Hey everyone. Last week or so I've received 3 or 4 emails from folks that are a little concerned about where they are with segmenting and coding. And this happens every semester. It's a weird process. We don't usually talk about language and about text in the ways that I'm trying to get you all to think about them in this class. So it's a very different thing. And so if you're in that boat and you haven't emailed me, you're not bugging me or anything like that, email me and I'd be happy to help you out. So I want to thank the folks that have reached out and said, hey, I need a little bit of help here. That's what I'm here for. So thanks again for doing that. I just want to kind of reiterate a few things. And I want to give you all an example of me working through coding on one of your projects. Rachel sent me some of her data. She was okay with me creating a video about her data, and I just kind of want to walk you through how I went about coding, segmenting one of her survey responses. I'm noticing that the concerns right now, they're usually about survey projects or about interview projects, and that's totally fine. It's a little overwhelming. I think that's the word Katie used. There's just a lot of data, and it's hard to understand where to put things. You all are also used to, when you're like reading a novel and you're interpreting what things mean, or you're applying some kind of theory to a text, the interpretation happens kind of simultaneously. You read something, you have a reaction to it. Coding verbal data is different. There's this layer between you interacting with text and coming up with an interpretation where you need to kind of more or less objectively quantify what's going on in that segment that you're trying to code, or in that survey response, or whatever it is that you're trying to analyze. So I think the complication for a lot of folks is that you might want to try to interpret right away, and when you have all that data, it gets very overloading. It's just way too much. So I want to show you all how to kind of slow things down just a little bit in order to segment and code verbal data in a way that I think is going to get you data that you can be used. I have not seen, nobody sent me data and I'm like, I don't know where this project's going. Everybody has something. It just takes a little bit of time and kind of suspending that desire to interpret things right away. Okay, so I'm going to switch things up here real quick, and you're going to take a look at a screen, and I'll kind of walk you through what I did with Rachel's data. So Rachel's working with a survey project where she's trying to understand, I'm going to paraphrase here her research question, but she's trying to understand how students perceive engagement at an institution like Shawnee State. She's surveying SSU students about engagement. And engagement has a few different domains, like connections with faculty, connections with other students, how difficult, how challenging their learning is. So she's got a question here asking about positive interactions with faculty members. So that's aligned with her research question. So she's in good shape there. So data that she has out of this question is going to help her answer the overall research question. It's going to take a piece of it. So we have, 16, 17 responses here. I left the names in. You guys are adults, and these are all positive things. So there's specific names of folks that are being mentioned here. So how do you go from this to coding? So what I did is I read through the data a few times to try to understand what are the ways to kind of cut this up, to segment it, so that I am coding things and I'm able to assign one code to it. So there's a lot of adjectives here describing faculty members. There's also verbs here in terms of like what faculty did. And then there's also statements where students are providing some context about what faculty were responding to when they did what they did that was positive. So thinking through the question, not the research question, but the survey question, to understand what are the kind of responses I'm going to receive and how can I chop those up so that I can code them, is a really important first step. So, and you use the question. You're not trying to interpret at this point. You're just trying to objectively quantify what is this segment, what's the 1 or 2 word descriptor that I can put to it that tells me what is going on in this segment. That is your only task here. The interpretation thing comes later. So just how do you go about coding this? You first have to know how to chop it up. So here is an Excel spreadsheet that has a column for participants. So we want to know what participant number it is in case we need to resort this. And you'll see in a second why resorting could be helpful. I have a larger column called buckets. I've talked to Katie and a few other folks in the class, and it's been helpful for some of them. I think it's been helpful to kind of understand, all right, what are just like the positive or the negative responses, or what are like the larger buckets, the two, maybe three buckets that you could put the responses into. That's been helpful. And then a code, and then sometimes a subcode or a comment about the code. And then we have segment over here. What's the segment that I have? So this is already completed. I just have, I blanked out the text, and hold on one second and I will show you the segments and the participants. Okay, so we have it broken up by mostly, I guess you'd probably say that they're T units. That's what I have here. There's some places where I have things that don't amount to a clause or a full sentence. But for the most part, these are T units. So professor allowed me to do the midterm late because my Blackboard wasn't working correctly. So there's what the faculty member did. So professor allowed. So subject, verb. I could just have gone with the verb. Allowed me to do midterm late. So what did the faculty do? They allowed me to do something late. Knew it was out of my hands, didn't hold it against me. So again, verbs, probably something to look at a little bit more closely. Emailed back quickly. And then we just have these here where was is a pretty weak verb. Awesome. So maybe just that adjective is the thing that I should be looking at when I'm going about coding. Encouraging, very thorough in responses. So I went through and I just kind of cut up those little pieces in ways that I would only be able to apply one code. And there were a few times when I went through coding this, where it was like, oh, I could put two codes with this. So I split it, I segmented that little bit up a little bit more. Over here, I kept the participant numbers. So both of these statements here are from participant 1. This one was from participant 2. This is going to be helpful later on when you start sorting and filtering and trying to get you're starting to kind of try to build a narrative about what's going on here in the data. So keeping the participants over here. Next, let me show you the bucket. So most of them are positive, and that makes sense because the way that the question is phrased. There's some folks where you're not asking for positive responses, you're just asking like, what was your experience, or describe this phenomenon. There, the buckets having positive and negative could be really helpful. Here, it's going to be less helpful. There's a couple folks that said something negative, like math professors do not, and they're talking about emailing back quickly. There's this like, I don't know what's going on here. Do not remember. That's the only thing that the student wrote. So that might mean that we just lose that segment. We just don't use that in our data, and that's fine. It just doesn't fit. The participant isn't really giving you data that you can work with. So overwhelmingly positive. What do the codes look like then? This is my understanding of what the codes would be, and I'm thinking about what the survey question is asking here. Describe a positive interaction. So first one, professor allowed me to do the midterm late because my Blackboard wasn't working correctly. For me, I think empathy was the word that stood out to me. You might have something slightly different, but it should be a word that that connotes that a faculty member made an allowance because something a student was going through. The word I put to that is empathy. With coding, it should be as objective as possible, but that doesn't mean we can't have slight differences in terms of what we would code something. So if you're like, oh, I wouldn't have coded that empathy, you might have said it was something like faculty understanding. That's awesome. That would be great. I think that works just fine. Rachel might even decide that works better. For me, it was empathy. I'm noticing here there's a lot of talk about communication. And the thing that's really interesting is Rachel did not ask, talk to me about a positive experience of communicating with a faculty member. It just said, tell me about a positive experience with a faculty member. But there's a lot of talk about communication here. There's so much talk about communication that I started putting subcodes because there were different ways that people were talking about communication. So a lot of people were talking about how timely the communication was, how fast things were. Other folks said like it was very thorough, like the response completely answered my questions. Consistency was another. Communication that led to learning, that was something else that participants were talking about. So the subcode here, particularly with codes that you're applying quite frequently, it becomes the thing that provides a little bit more clarity to what that code is. Something else here that you'll notice, like I have just positive descriptor in here. I think if I was, what's difficult about this response is that you could segment it by verbs, and that captures a lot of the data. You could also segment it by adjectives. So what I did is I tried to keep as much of the responses that I had, the verbs and the adjectives, kind of keeping them together. And where there was some overlap, let me show you right here. So participant 9 said, I emailed my calculus professor about a type of problem on an upcoming test. He responded within 2 hours. So I try to keep as much of this context as possible. So it has the verb. He responded within 2 hours. So that, for me, was communication timely. But then, right after that participant wrote that, he responded within 2 hours, was very helpful with his response, communication, and helpful. So I'm providing enough of a segment so that I can code and understand the context. But then when I notice that there's something that, well, I could assign a different code to this, I split it out and I use these brackets when I'm repeating something from a previous segment, if that makes sense. I was trying to say that I kept positive descriptors when I just had adjectives. So there's a few positive descriptors in here. There's not a ton. Are excellent. There's not really something with a verb here. So I could have segmented and only looked at verbs. I would have lost, though, awesome, encouraging. I would have lost some of these terms in here, that some of these adjectives that might be helpful to Rachel down the line. My sense looking at this data, the communication thing's pretty huge. And so I think that she definitely has something to write about there with that. Also putting this in Excel allows you to do cool things with coding, or I'm not coding, well it does coding, but also sorting. So being able to sort by buckets, there's not much diversity there. Let's say we want to add a level in subcode. So we look at all that communication. Also a fair bit of talk about empathy. Got 2 or 3 different respondents that are talking about empathy. So Rachel has something to write about here. Definitely has something to write about here. I will bet you a dozen Jolly Pirate donuts. If you know me, you know how much I love Jolly Pirate donuts. I will bet you Jolly Pirate donuts that you got something in your own data that you can write about. Definitely happy to talk to you, to work through with you and doing some of this. If you're going to email me and you want to do this some kind of work, I want you to take a shot at building something like this. If you struggle with that, let me know. I'd be happy to help you out. But if you want to have a conversation about your data, try to get it into this format. And if you have problems with that, reach out to me and let me know. We are almost done. My dumb puns on the Blackboard site are going to come to an end pretty soon. You guys are going to have your presentations wrapped up here in just a few weeks. Keep at it. You all are working hard. You're doing good stuff. Even though that some of you probably feel like you're experiencing a little bit of senioritis, hang in there. You're doing good stuff, I promise you. Reach out if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you all soon.